So hello everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar co-hosted by Climate Legacy and the Group of 78 on community-owned renewable energy. My name is Roy Culpepper. I chair the Group of 78. First, on behalf of the Group of 78 and Climate Legacy, I wish to acknowledge that the City of Ottawa, the place from which I'm making these introductory remarks, is in the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. In the wake of the recent discovery of hundreds and likely thousands of bodies of children in unmarked graves on the sites of residential schools in a number of locations across Canada, we condemn the systemic racism that led to their tragic deaths. We grieve with Indigenous families and communities and express our solidarity in their search for justice. This is the fifth in a series of seminars that have been co-hosted by the Group of 78 and Climate Legacy, focused on how investment choices drive greenhouse gas emissions and the climate crisis. Alternative investment choices can, on the other hand, accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. In past webinars, we have examined the role individual investors can play in allocating their retirement savings, the role of institutional investors in managing pension funds, and the role of governments that fund or subsidize fossil fuel production, but could instead invest in renewable energy and green technology. In this webinar, In this webinar, we examine the role of investors coming together at the community level to finance renewable energy. We are privileged to have as our guest speakers two individuals who have helped create the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op and CoEnergy. Dick Bakker and Aaron Thornell will be introduced shortly by our moderator, Ricky Stewart. Please note, neither Climate Legacy nor the Group of 78 are recommending any particular financial product or service. Rather, it is our hope that this discussion will help those who have funds to invest, to encourage them to do their own research, speak with their financial advisors, and make their investment decisions accordingly. Now, a brief introduction of Ricky Stewart, our moderator, who has moderated some of our previous panels. Ricky currently lives in Victoria, BC, probably the coolest part of that province right now, and works part-time as a consultant on organizational change and gender equality. She was executive director of Oxfam Canada and was deputy director of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. She has taught at St. Francis Xavier University's Coady Institute. She has been a volunteer teacher, consultant, and board member, and is currently affiliated with Gender at Work and with the Climate Legacy Project. So Ricky, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody from BC, where it's still morning. We have two speakers today, and one of them will make a slide presentation. After that, and as the presentation continues, if you have questions that you'd like the panelists to address, we invite you to put them in the Q&A section, which you'll find at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, hopefully. And I will organize the order in which the questions are addressed and try to group them. Beyond that, we have an hour planned for this session. And before we begin, before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to say a word about Climate Legacy. Climate Legacy is a project that a group of us, mainly based in Ottawa, decided a couple of years ago when Greta Thunberg first came onto our screens. We said to each other, well, after all, it shouldn't only be up to the youth to address climate issues. What are we doing, people in our age group, to do our bit? We've been part of creating the situation, so we should also help to do something to fix it. And we decided to start a process of encouraging people to take action on climate change, our peers. We've been successful in getting over 30 groups to join our network to support each other and learn from each other. And one of the other activities we've been undertaking is these webinars, as well as some work with institutional pension funds. I'd like to introduce our speakers. The Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative has been around for a lot of years and has undertaken a number of projects to invest in renewable energy in the community. And I'm delighted that our two speakers are able to be with us. First is Aaron Thornell, who is the general manager of OREC. And the second speaker will be Dick Bakker, who is the former president of OREC and now is a board member. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Aaron to start the presentation.
Thanks very much, Ricky, and thanks to all of you folks for tuning in today, and to Climate Legacy and the Group of 78 for allowing us to share some of our work with you. I'll just take a moment to share my screen. So as mentioned, I'm here to talk to you today about the Renewable Energy Cooperative. So for those who aren't familiar, and maybe some of you are in the Ottawa area, OREC has been around for many years, as Ricky pointed out, since 2010, when Dick and 4 other individuals incorporated the cooperative. And I'm personally very grateful that they took those steps and bravely went forward with this initiative. Really, at its core, OREC is an organization that seeks to connect individuals like those of you on this call, but the broader community as a whole, with the kinds of projects, specifically renewable energy projects, that we all want to see in our own communities and in our own regions. We do that through a couple different means, but primarily it's by allowing, through the cooperative business model, for individuals to be co-owners and directors, if you will, of renewable energy development in the Ottawa and, more broadly speaking, Eastern Ontario region. As mentioned, we incorporated in 2010, and at the time, and we continue to operate this way as a for-profit cooperative. The reasons for this really have to do with the different kinds of regulations available to us at the time to feed into the various procurement programs offered through the provincial government, the feed-in tariff program that some folks may be familiar with. And so we operate under the Cooperative Corporations Act, but of course, a number of other governing bodies and regulatory bodies sort of dictate our day-to-day operations, and namely the Financial Services Regulatory Authority, but also, the Electricity Act, the OEB, the Independent Electricity Systems Operator, and so very much broadly, we are governed at a provincial level, given the work that we do. So a quick snapshot of sort of what OREC has done to date. Just last week, actually, we crossed the 800 member threshold, which I think was an exciting one for a lot of us. As I say, from a group of 5 individuals at the start, we've seen our numbers grow remarkably over the years. And all of these individuals have, at least at one point in time, called Ottawa or Eastern Ontario, broadly speaking, home. When I say Eastern Ontario, for the purposes of this discussion, our cooperative defines that region broadly as sort of the border with Quebec in the east and the Kingston area in the west. And so that's the sort of area that we've historically operated within, but we are expanding slightly. And I'll talk a bit about that soon. Really, the common thread throughout all these members, these 800 individuals who are members of our cooperative, is that they are passionate about solving the climate crisis in one way or another. So for some folks, that means adding their voice, sort of a collective call and advocacy efforts. For others, it means, through some of the investment work that we do and divestment work that we have accomplished over the years. Of those 800 members, about half of those individuals have invested with OREC over the years, and I'll talk a little bit sort of broadly about how that mechanism works in a moment. But to date, we've developed or co-own 21 solar projects located primarily in Ottawa, with 2 others located east of Ottawa in Alfred and Hawkesbury, respectively. Of these 21 projects, 18 of these were developed through that feed-in tariff program that I alluded to earlier. So for those folks who aren't familiar with it, the feed-in tariff program was part of the Green Energy Act, launched by the province of Ontario in 2009, and really gave cooperatives, but also municipalities, Indigenous communities, private corporations and individuals the chance to develop renewable energy assets and renewable energy projects, and sell the electricity from those projects directly to the Ontario power grid for a rate per kilowatt hour produced. And so that's how we developed 18 of our projects, through a series of bidding on contracts with the province, getting approval, and then proceeding to develop those. Our group, as a cooperative, was in a unique position to sort of get community buy-in by virtue of having groups of members in certain parts of the province that allowed us to operate in those areas. Since the 2018 provincial election and the election of the Ford government, we have seen the renewable energy landscape, and the energy landscape for that matter, change somewhat. We're now operating under what's called a net metering sort of system paradigm within the renewable energy space. And broadly speaking, this essentially allows groups like OREC to work directly with facility owners and develop renewable energy projects on their own land, property, or rooftops, as the case may be. So pictured here on the left is our project with the Canadian Museum of Science and Technology on St. Laurent Boulevard, which folks I'm sure in Ottawa are familiar with. And that was our first net metering project that we brought online in 2019. As I mentioned, a big part of the work we do is the financial portion of our work, and really aiming to catalyze renewable energy development through the financing, community financing of renewable energy projects. So we've raised $8 million from our membership entirely over the last 8 years or so, since we started doing investment raises in 2012. And over the course of time, we've returned about $2 million to investors. And of course, that number will grow as time goes on. So just to give folks a snapshot about how we operate and really the process that we go through, on a sort of cyclical basis. We begin by either developing new projects, or in certain cases, acquiring existing projects. Bringing existing assets under community control is very much part of our mandate, as well as adding new renewable energy generation to the Ontario sort of power mix. So we work in partnership with schools, institutions like the museum that I mentioned, municipalities, as well as private businesses and private landowners to identify opportunities for renewable energy development. Historically, as you saw, we've focused on solar energy and solar PV, solar photovoltaic specifically. Although, of course, we know as time goes on, we are starting to expand beyond solar rooftop, and I'll talk a bit about that soon. Once we identify projects, as I say, either for acquisition or for development, we essentially price those out. And we do that through, procurement methods where necessary, bidding, requests for proposals and bids when that's required. And we usually work with local organizations to do that. Folks in the Ottawa area may know of groups like iSolera or Exicon Solar. These are two organizations, for example, that we've worked with a number of times over the years. Once we identify that sort of dollar figure that's required to realize these projects, we then develop our own investment products, our own securities. As a cooperative, we're in a unique position to be able to do this, although we do go through fairly rigorous vetting through that. A number of different regulatory bodies within the provincial government. And we essentially pool this capital to realize these projects. That is where the community ownership, the community investment portion of our work comes to play. Revenues for our cooperative are generated primarily through the sale of electricity, as you can imagine. So as I mentioned, that feed-in tariff program, we generate electricity, which is sold to the Independent Electricity Systems Operator, or the IESO, which is a crown corporation of the provincial government of Ontario. And with those projects, there is a rate per kilowatt hour produced. In the case of our net metering projects, like some of the ones I mentioned, we're actually leasing them that solar equipment in those cases as a bit of a, I suppose you could say, workaround to the current regulatory environment that Ontario has, and certainly happy to unpack that comment a little bit more down the line. But at the end of the day, our aim is to move institutions, organizations, and the city of Ottawa and other municipalities towards 100% renewable energy. From that point on, of course, the profits that the cooperative earns are returned to investors and to shareholders, or those who have provided loans for the cooperative in the form of capital repayment and interest payments or dividends, as the case may be. So to speak a little bit about membership is, for any cooperative, and folks familiar with the cooperative business model know that membership is really foundational to everything that we do. Our members give us our mandate, as the board and the staff by extension, and really what we do is to provide services and opportunities to our members. As I mentioned, our membership has grown tremendously over the years, and interestingly, we try to run analyses every couple years or so on how folks find out about us, and we've been really pleased, I think, to find that over the years it's been primarily through word of mouth that folks have found out about us. So I think it speaks to the growing community, but also the growing interest and willingness that individuals have to share with their friends, with their family, with their neighbors, the opportunities to get involved personally in the renewable energy transition and the low carbon transition, which I know is equally shared by groups like Climate Legacy and the Group of 78. At this point in time, I mentioned that Eastern Ontario catchment area. We've also opened up membership to a couple different counties in southwestern Ontario, and that will become obvious for reasons in a few moments. We're actually working on some projects in that part of the province, and that's why the board and membership deemed it very appropriate to welcome members from that part of the province as well. As with cooperatives, the purchase of a membership share is a requirement to becoming a member, and that's a one-time $100 purchase. And really, with membership, I've spoken a little bit about what it means to be a member of OREC, but primarily, you are joining a growing chorus of voices for the transition to renewable energy. Dick and other members of of the OREC team do a lot in the way of advocacy, which we'll talk about shortly. But when you're able to sort of say you're an organization representing 800 individuals, that carries a lot of weight with elected officials at all levels of government. And we've certainly seen, I think, slowly those individuals, those elected officials, starting to pay more attention to what we're doing as time goes on and as our numbers grow. Core and central to the cooperative business model and the principles of all cooperatives that are recognized sort of internationally is the one member vote system. So, regardless of if folks have chosen to invest whatsoever in our group, or if they've invested, hundreds of thousands of dollars, it doesn't give them any more or less say than another member. So everything we do is sort of democratically governed by that one member, one vote principle, as well as the 6 other principles that guide all co-ops internationally. Of course, membership also comes with the chance to directly participate in the sort of day-to-day operations, or at the board level with the cooperative. And of course, as we'll talk about briefly towards the end here, there's the chance to invest in the cooperative. As time goes on and as our organization evolves and matures, we are also looking for ways that our cooperative can provide direct services to our members. There's a lot of discussion these days, I'm sure folks are following, about home energy retrofits and other services of that nature. So we are continuing to think about ways that our cooperative could play a role in helping folks navigate those kinds of opportunities. Just taking a moment to speak a little bit about advocacy, and I'll, Dick may jump in here as he certainly leads a lot of our efforts on this front. As I mentioned, a huge part of our work is to give voice to our members at various levels of government and with various regulatory bodies, both provincially and federally, and municipality for that matter as well. And so here's a snapshot really of where we see and where we've already seen the energy system and the energy grid in Ontario going. We've historically had a very centralized, somewhat rigid energy system here in Ontario, and it's not unique. Many other jurisdictions in in Canada, as well as parts of the United States and even further afield, have followed this model to an extent. But we are now seeing, with the advent of renewable energy, technologies, storage technologies, and even simply software innovations, for that matter, we are starting to see a very much more decentralized and localized distributed energy generation system. And from our perspective, I think that makes us very happy. When folks are more connected to the energy that they're using on a day-to-day basis, I think it brings a lot more consciousness to how we consume and how we use our energy on a day-to-day sort of basis. So we've certainly carried out lots of conversations with, as I say, lots of levels of government, as well as different regulatory bodies. I think we are having some success more so of late, as the conversation around climate change begins to take greater root in our collective psyche and collective consciousness, that new, not necessarily new in the grand scheme of things, but new to Ottawa, new to Ontario models are needed to continue this sort of shift towards a decentralized energy system. So conversations with Hydro Ottawa, other distribution companies, and groups of that nature are certainly starting to gain more traction in the recent months and years, I would say. Although, of course, in certain situations, it's never as fast as we would like. I would advocate. To give folks a snapshot of the kinds of projects that OREC has accomplished, Dick, do you want to jump in?
I was just going to, if you just moved back to that last slide, I'll just leave everyone with three thoughts that are kind of founding to OREC and the renewable energy co-ops around the world. First of all, a wind turbine or a solar array, solar on a roof, owned by the people that can see it, looks a lot better than one that's owned by a distant pension fund or a distant bank. Mm-hmm. Secondly, if that asset, that renewable energy generating asset, is owned by the local people, keeping the jobs, the profits, and the electrons local, there'll be a lot more support for it than if it's not keeping the jobs, electrons, and profits local. And thirdly, if the politicians and media understand point one and point two, there'll be an awful lot more support for renewable and a cleaner economy generally. So that's sort of the overpowering ethos of what OREC and CoEnergy are trying to do.
Yeah, really valuable, Dick. And just to sort of tag on to that as we move into just a look at our work, we borrowed this model, and I think we'll talk a bit about it later, but we've certainly, haven't developed this on our own. Folks may be familiar with the, renewable energy cooperatives that are really, really prevalent in areas like Germany and Denmark and other parts of Northern Europe, where they've played an extremely valuable role in this transition to a renewable energy grid. So to snapshot of our projects, these will range in you'll see in sort of size, scope, and technology type to an extent. we certainly have some projects from before this one. Our first were actually in 2012. We did a group of 5 microfit, so under 10 kilowatt projects with affordable housing providers in Ottawa, both housing cooperatives and nonprofit housing. But this project with Hovey was certainly one of our larger ones in our early days, if you will call it that, as we were continuing to learn, how best to navigate this feed-in tariff procurement system that the government of Ontario was offering at the time. We've done a lot of work with various different kinds of groups, as I mentioned, but this one is important to us because, as Dick always reminds me of, as I mentioned, the popularity of renewable energy co-ops in jurisdictions like Germany was really driven by the farming communities, and you could say traditionally conservative, sort of small c conservative, individuals and communities, but seeing the opportunity, as Dick said, to have jobs and profits and energy itself kept local was, I think, something that really accelerated that transition in those parts. And of course, working with farmers here in the Ottawa area was very important to us as well. In 2017, we brought this project online, which was exciting for us for a couple reasons. It was our first of this nature, the sort of solar farm, as it's sort of known, or ground mount system, but also because we were working with the municipality of Alfred and Kiiwewin First Nation on this project. So this land that you see where this solar farm is located is municipal land. So we lease it from the municipality of Alfred. It's deemed unusable for agricultural purposes and for any other purposes. It's an old sort of drainage area in the system, in the municipality, actually. And so that was one of the rules of the feed-in tariff program, I should say, is arable land cannot be used for things like solar farms and to an extent for wind turbines as well as other renewable energy generation. But exciting for us to develop this project. It also utilizes what are called single access tracker panels. So the panels you see are sort of in tabletop mode, and they'll actually follow the trajectory of the sun over the course of the day to maximize and increase production. I mentioned, that we've worked with various institutions. We've done a lot of work with the schools, 2 different school boards here in Ottawa. This school is part of the French Public Board. We've also done a lot of work with the French Catholic Board. You saw this project before with the Canadian Museum of Science and Technology. Really exciting for us, as I mentioned, was our first net metering project, but also, as Dick can attest, we've been chatting with discussions with the museum for the better part of 8 or 9 years, I think, before this, the piece of this puzzle came together, and we were able to realize this project. So quite happy to have seen all that hard work come to fruition over the years. And I mentioned the French Catholic School Board that we've done a number of projects with. This was one of 2 of our most recent projects on the relatively new Mère High School in Orleans. There's a very similar new school in Stittsville, and the Paul Desmarais High School, that we also did a similar project on at the same time. And we were able to realize these projects through COVID, and absolutely led by our stellar project manager, Vadim Bolot-Zerkovsky, who has done amazing work with the cooperative over the years. Just sort of shifting gears a little bit here, folks, to talk to you about what we're up to now. And as I mentioned, we're expanding beyond the solar photovoltaic space to enter into the wind energy space. So we are currently working on the final acquisition of the 2 existing wind turbines in southwestern Ontario. They're both located along the shores of Lake Huron. And we're excited about this for a couple different reasons, but one of the main reasons is our work. We're doing this in partnership with Enerforge. And Enerforge is a division of Oshawa Power Utility Corporation. So basically the Oshawa version of Hydro Ottawa, if you will. And they're an exciting counterparty, in part because they're extremely enthusiastic about renewable energy generation, and they're very enthusiastically pursuing both the acquisition of existing projects, but also the development of new projects. And so we've really found an alignment, sort of a values alignment with this organization. and we're excited about the opportunities potentially down the line to continue work with them. These projects were privately owned historically since they were brought online. And so for us, bringing them under community ownership is a really valuable step. This is a part of the province where wind energy, I would suggest, is somewhat controversial. It's very heavily developed wind area. And so we're looking to introduce our model, as Dick alluded to earlier, that helps sort of change the narrative around renewable energy and renewable energy projects in this part of the province. And I think we're starting to see that happen in sort of fits and starts as we've gone on. To do this, we are, the best example of the way I can sort of explain what we do is by, what we're up to right now, which is raising capital through investment products to finance these acquisitions. So right now we're on track to hit our $1.3 million target, which we launched at the beginning of June, and we're looking to sort of hit that target by sort of later this month, if not early August. So just a snapshot of these projects in particular. They're located in Zurich, Ontario, and the other in Tiverton, Ontario, just up the way. It is new for us to be working in the wind space, but fortunately these are existing projects. So, this one brought online in 2010, the other you'll see here brought online in 2014. These are also built with Enercon turbines. So for the tech folks out there, very reliable, very much leaders in the wind energy space. These are German manufactured turbines that have a pretty strong, I would say a very strong track record in the wind energy market. These two particular turbines have sort of hit their 95% generation targets every year since they were brought online. So just to take a step back about why OREC is not only stepping outside of the solar rooftop and solar photovoltaic space, but also why we're sort of migrating or taking these projects into southwestern Ontario. Certainly, our focus remains on Ottawa and Eastern Ontario. 800 of our members are part of these communities, and so we very much are maintaining our focus when it comes to new projects in this area. But it is also the chance for us to sort of take a step in our organizational evolution, both in terms of scale of our portfolio, but also in terms of the kinds of technologies that we are familiar with. I think for folks on this call, a lot of you are probably following work that the city of Ottawa and other, municipalities around this area have been doing, sort of plotting their plans for renewable energy and zero carbon or net zero carbon, futures, and certain, landmarks of net zero by 2050 and these kinds of things require a lot of, obviously upfront work in the, as soon as possible, given the climate crisis. We recognize that wind energy is probably going to play a pretty important role in that. And so for that reason, as well as some of the others that I've mentioned, this was a very sort of logical step for OREC, to learn what it is like to operate these kinds of assets is an important step for an organization like ours. We have a lot of wind energy expertise on our board and within our sort of broader OREC family. But of course, nothing beats the real thing, which is, the cooperative actually bringing these projects into our portfolio. The final thing I mentioned is that sort of final bullet point, which is that, as Dick alluded to, a very much a changing renewable energy landscape in Ontario. We've historically called our work in solar, we ride on the solar coaster, because it's never clear, what different administrations at the provincial level are going to do. Obviously, folks will maybe remember in 2018, the Ford government definitely took, in our opinion, took the renewable energy space a step in the wrong direction with the cancellation of a number of, to be built feed-in tariff projects. But we are still we still see progress happening at different levels and at different paces. So working with Enerforge to even further increase our advocacy sort of position and our negotiating position with different regulatory bodies was a valuable step for us, and also being able to sort of speak to two different kinds of very critical renewable energy generation was of equal importance to us, and so moving in that direction was another reason why the board took this step. Just wanting to keep moving here, I'll speak just quickly to how we're raising capital at this point in time. And as mentioned, this is for information purpose only. We are raising through the development of our very own preference shares. So we develop our own securities that, as I mentioned earlier, are vetted by the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario. It's a very rigorous process, but we're very grateful that we go through it. Allows us to, essentially make sure all of our numbers are correct when we're running our cash flow analyses and different things like that. So the preference shares that we have available right now are 15-year Class B shares. They are RSP and TFSA eligible. They earn an annual dividend declared by the board of directors. We're anticipating that first one to come not until December 2022 in all likelihood. They have a capital return sort of in a general prorated format from years 3 through 15, and the annual dividend we are targeting is 3.5% to 4%. But of course, I'm here to say that's not a guarantee, although that is what our numbers are showing us. So we're certainly confident in those numbers. You'll see the minimum investments there, and the a little bit higher for RSP and TFSA. It's a bit more of a process to go through. Just to speak quickly to how we do that, we work with, namely, in particular, the Canadian Workers Cooperative Federation, which for folks who don't know of, CWCF is an incredible organization, really, a cooperative, as the name obviously suggests, that enables groups across the country to develop these kinds of investment products to allow them to hold them in these registered account types, but also to help new cooperatives and new businesses to consider what the cooperative structure can bring to their organization. I know they do a lot with worker cooperatives and helping those groups sort of develop their sort of governance structures and their sort of operation structures, and really have been very close partners to OREC since 2012, since we started, raising capital. We also work a little bit with Caldwell Securities, but less so these days. But they're a group in Toronto that has also helped groups like Solar Share and other cooperatives across the province do the work that they do. So I don't want to dwell too long on this. I believe that brings me to the end of my slide deck. So I'm happy to stop sharing now, and we can certainly address some of the questions I've been seeing coming through from the audience.
Thank you very much, Aaron. All right, so we do have a couple of outstanding questions, and the one was from Richard Harmston. What are the main impediments to advancing your model? Economic, social, political?
Dick, go ahead. Yeah, I know you want to answer that one.
I would say it's political will and regulations, which is also political will. The electricity system, Aaron was too polite on the electricity grid. Almost every electricity grid in the world was designed 100 years ago with a Stalinist model of a 5 to 7 year planning horizon and big centralized power plants that were financed by 1 million consumers. The world has changed dramatically and the regulations haven't adjusted to it. There's only a few places in the world that are starting to look seriously at distributed energy resources and integrated resource planning for regions. And that's where the future is. The internet destroyed the old telecom world, which is the world I worked in for 25 years. And the distributed energy resources, together with selective battery use and storage and intelligent grid management, will destroy the existing energy system. That's my short answer. And that's a hard thing to explain to people. It's not a 5-second television spot. Soundbite. That's the word. Yeah. It's not a soundbite. It's a hard, long explanation, but it is the reality. And as being with OREC for 12 years now, I've seen every gyration possible in Ontario. The beauty is that the cost of big central power plants is getting bigger and harder and more difficult. Another question was, is NIMBY a big issue? Yes. It is always an issue. Environmentalists are often against big generation assets or generation assets that they see. So we have an option now through co-op ownership to make that a yes, please in my backyard. If I'm earning from that turning turbine, it looks a lot better than if it's paying a pension fund from far away. If it's contributing to our mortgage payments, that's a good thing. But we don't want 10,000 turbines in one place. We want to spread it around and do it at the distribution side, not on the transmission side, which is another discussion. So.
Thanks. Roy, you had a question, and I know you couldn't type it in.
Yes, thank you, Ricky. I just wanted to pick up on references made by Aaron in his presentation to other municipalities. It seems like on one extreme, you have the North European examples of, you mentioned Denmark and Germany. And then we have OREC in Ottawa. I was wondering if you could situate what OREC is in Ottawa to the larger Canadian context. Are there other municipalities doing something even more impressive? And if so, which are they? And then how far would we have to go from OREC to a German municipality of the kind that Aaron was alluding to? Is that a huge distance to scale up?
Jake, do you want to go?
Okay. There isn't at this point in time a strong political will or understanding that there's millions of dollars of untapped capital in communities. There is. That's what we're spending a lot of time trying to get the federal and provincial governments to understand. Across Canada, Saskatchewan has 2 renewable energy co-ops that I'm aware of, one in Saskatoon, one in Regina, Wascana, and SES in Saskatoon, Wascana and Regina. Alberta has 3 renewable energy co-ops. Similar, I'm talking about organizations that are raising money for group ownership of assets as opposed to buyer co-ops. There's a couple of buyer co-ops in BC and Alberta. That's different than what we're doing. We're almost like a little pension fund, people pooling their money and owning an asset bigger than what they could do on their own house, right? So that's what I'm talking about. So in BC, I'm not aware of any investment co-ops there. There may be, but I'm not aware. 2 in Alberta, or 3 in Alberta, 2 in Saskatchewan, 1 in Manitoba that hasn't been able to execute anything yet. And the president of that co-op is a Conservative MP, Daniel Mazer. So if this is not a political, this shouldn't be political. This should be supported by rural farmers. If they own the land, they should be able to own the air above the land. Right. In Quebec, I'm not that familiar with Quebec, but Quebec Hydro has done some work with community groups in the Beauce area, and co-ops generally are pretty strong in Quebec, but Quebec Hydro runs the electricity system and is the regulator. So that, I think, is a conflict of interest. But let's leave that aside. Nova Scotia has several. They're not called co-ops down there. They're Aaron. Do you know what they're called?
It's like a local economic development.
That's right.
Yeah, community economic development investment funds. Yeah,
and they kind of operate like a co-op. You have to be within the community to invest in them. The NDP government several years ago set that structure up, and they had no opposition to wind almost no opposition to wind, because all the wind turbines in the province had to be community owned by these locally run businesses. And I know that New Brunswick is starting up a couple of co-ops. PEI, I don't think has anything yet, but I may be wrong. I'm not as familiar with the Maritimes outside of Nova Scotia. So there's, and in Ontario, there were 25 co-ops set up at one time. About 8 of them are working to some level like us. Solar Share is the largest. London has 8 or 9 projects, smaller. It just takes time to get a co-op going. It takes time to do the paperwork. It's not friendly as far as legal, insurance, and all that stuff. Once you get to a scale, then it can grow, and you need consistent government policy. And we have not had that in the province. And we've had a electricity grid that has had a hard time accepting small-scale projects. So when you have the regulators and the electricity operators who don't really want to do this new thing, it was imposed in Ontario by Smitherman over the heads of the party, the Liberal Party, and over the objections of the electricity operators. All their claims that it couldn't work were wrong, were proven wrong. And then, unfortunately, the Ontario Liberals lost 9 ridings that won the most projects in the next election because of NIMBY. People didn't understand it because Ontarians are used to cheap power that comes from far away that they don't relate to. So there was bad ignorance about what is electricity and how it can be localized. But I'll try to get out of the box.
I have a different question, and I also can't type in the box. There's recently been some comment that I've seen about the support for retrofitting and energy efficiency in existing buildings, which says that it is very foolish to do those on a building by building scale, and that it would be smarter to do those as community-based projects that can take advantage of things like heat pumps, for example. I'm wondering if this might represent an opportunity for an organization like OREC.
Yeah, maybe I can speak a little bit to that. Ricky, you introduced both Dick and I as sort of wearing 2 hats. We work with OREC, but also in 2018, OREC developed another cooperative, a sort of sister cooperative, if you will, CoEnergy Co-operative. And that group seeks to pick up that sort of mantle, or that opportunity, if you will, in the building energy retrofit space. Really, CoEnergy was designed to implement in that same way of both technically and financially supporting projects in the deep energy retrofit space. Primarily looking at multi-unit residential buildings, so apartments, condos, nonprofit housing, and different kinds of facilities there, but also more broadly speaking, recreational facilities, and to an extent that we can play a role in the residential sort of single or non multi-unit residential space, if you will. So we certainly are very much eager on that front to play a role there. You mentioned heat pumps, certainly a key technology that I think we'll all become much more familiar with as time goes on, and that will play a hugely important role in our transition to a low carbon future. And so I would certainly agree to an extent that it is challenging at times. The economics can be challenging to tackle sort of one-off smaller projects. It's for that very same reason that OREC has unfortunately not been able to maybe, work with individual homeowners. Just the economies of scale are not quite there for solar for us to be able to potentially play a role. However, going forward, we definitely see ourselves as playing a role in both the as I like to think of it, two sides of the sustainability coin. It's both renewable energy generation and conservation, energy conservation. So I would certainly agree with you, Ricky, that there's an opportunity knocking for groups like ours to help the adoption of that kind of work.
However, I will challenge you, Ricky, on the first part of your question. If you look at your electricity bill, you'll see that half of your bill, if not more, is distribution, shipping, and overhead. When you hear about electricity production costing 2 cents, 4 cents, 3 cents, 12 cents, that's not what the delivered cost is. There's an avoided cost. You're avoiding certain costs by putting generation on top of your building. It doesn't fit on every building. There's trees, there's different slope, different production capabilities, but the whole grid evolution has been based on big central power plants far away and shipping it a long distance. If we're going to start driving electric cars, having heat pump dehumidifiers, that is going to drive up the overall consumption everywhere. We need more generation closer to consumption. That's a different paradigm than what the engineers who designed the grid were thinking. And they have to change their paradigm. The economics will force them to, because we can't ship it from today in Ontario, 3 locations bring us 60% of our power. Bruce, Darlington, and Pickering. That has to be shipped to 25 million locations. There's line loss everywhere.
It would be very interesting to make a compelling economic argument along those lines that I haven't seen done in a popular way.
Yeah, in a popular way. They're being made all the time, but there's vested interests that want the continuation of what we have now.
Okay, I don't see any other questions.
There's a couple in the sort of open category, Ricky, which I'm happy to sort of maybe touch on briefly. One from Bessa Whitmore, which is sort of speaking to the sort of challenge that we just alluded to of it being difficult for individual homeowners, for example, who have a flat roof, to incorporate solar. And certainly we've seen the price of solar panels come down precipitously over the last decade or so, to the tune of 70-80% in the last 10 years. And that's certainly made it more accessible, but still challenging, right? We're still talking about a fairly expensive price point for a residential size rooftop array. The rent-a-roof scheme that you sort of allude to, Bessa, is kind of the feed-in tariff program, and so sadly that has wound down. But I would say we're continuing to move towards a place where that option may be available. But your question sort of gives me the opportunity to speak to another model that I think may be more likely and potentially more accessible for folks in the Ottawa area and up across the country. And it's in the industry, it's called virtual net metering, but essentially it allows for a sort of centralized solar system array, say on the roof of a large industrial building or a school, even in your neighborhood, to be developed by a group like OREC, for example, and then allow individual homeowners to essentially be virtual owners of portions of that project through this, essentially what amounts to an accounting practice. And so virtual net metering is a huge piece of the energy sort of puzzle, in our opinion, and one of the main things we've been advocating on with different groups over the years. It was set to come into effect in 2018, but it was rolled back by the Ford government, sadly. We think that will be a very big, a really sort of watershed moment for renewable energy in especially in urban spaces like Ottawa, where individuals could and and even businesses could essentially be co-owners of a larger system that isn't necessarily located on their own roof, but in effect, as the name suggests, it's virtually located on your roof, and so therefore directly offsetting your energy bill. So certainly we are seeing the technology making leaps and strides, but as Dick has mentioned a couple of times, it's also the regulation that needs to follow suit. So we're hopeful that that will come to pass soon. And I've seen the question twice here. Sorry, Ricky, go ahead.
I was just, yes, I think you were maybe going to speak about the potential for wind power. Yeah, absolutely. And it's, our group, when we started with OREC, and Dick can speak to this as well, Eastern Ontario has a very high solar potential. We've alluded to Germany and, city like Berlin, not the same as Ottawa in a lot of ways, but, Ottawa, for example, has a much, much better solar potential and solar generation opportunity than Berlin, for example. But of course, in Berlin, we see solar on, thousands and thousands of rooftops across that large city. Wind power has potential in Ottawa and Eastern Ontario. But again, it's more likely that we'll probably look to find regulatory opportunities for systems to be located, outside of the city, not looking to impose them upon communities in those areas, but to find opportunities, again, through community ownership, potentially to situate them in areas where there is better wind potential and allow that energy to be sort of feeding into the Ottawa distribution network. We are working actually right now, very, very early stages with the City of Ottawa, with other groups to sort of do a bit of an assessment of what wind potential there is in Ottawa and Eastern Ontario. And I think we'll be seeing a lot more about that in the coming months, as I've alluded to the sort of net zero energy plans and net zero emissions plans that groups like the City of Ottawa have published. Those call for very significant amounts of wind energy to be, part of that puzzle, as well as, solar, as well as renewable natural gas, and a whole range of other things, as well as retrofits, as Ricky alluded to. So we will see more, I think, in the way of this kind of study sort of fleshing itself out in months to come. There's a last question about building in resilience.
Well, if I can take that question. So resilience has several connotations. One is network resilience of the electricity grid. I'd say it's not very resilient to have 60% of your power coming from 3 locations at the far end of the province. Then there's a resilience in your community. The closer the power is to the generation, to the consumption or the load, the better. The system is not built that way in mind. The system is built as consumers over there, generation over here. And the two are not intertwined. The internet is much more resilient than the old telecom system of 30 years ago. And resilience in our project, we have contractors that understand it. We spend the time to design it properly, make sure it adheres properly to the roof. We're trying what we can, but the main way to provide resilience is to have a resilient electricity grid. We've got a grid that's fairly good for a centralized grid. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, and there's a last question. There's a last question, which is 2 questions really. One about flat roofs and solar panels, and the second part of that question is about the federal subsidy. I don't believe it's applicable to solar panels, but you can confirm that.
Yeah. It is applicable for solar. As far as I know, there's a few groups in Ottawa that are sort of offering services along those lines. With respect to the flat roof question, if I understand it correctly, flat roofs are absolutely good for solar panels. I hope no one has told you to the contrary. I hope I didn't tell you that in some way through this presentation. But we've certainly got the vast majority of our projects, I would say, on or a number of our projects on flat roofs. Slanted roofs have their opportunities as well, provided they're oriented in the right direction, sort of thing. But certainly, flat roofs and slanted roofs alike are quite beneficial for solar. There are some structural components that need to be sort of addressed, or the sort of check mark needs to be given when developing a new project. But as time goes on and as solar panels get more lightweight and roofs are generally built better, that has rarely been a limiting factor for our group in the past.
There's another question that popped up about managing snow on flat roofs. So the panel needs to be at an angle. Can everybody see that? So that's probably the best angle. As the sun goes across, you catch it at a certain point in time, and it diminishes early and later. Snow buildup is a problem in Ottawa. 60% of our generation is in the 5 months around May, June, July, August, September. That's where
it's even closer. Yeah, it's even closer to like 75 now. We're seeing essentially the winter months are not a huge loss if there are snow issues, but as Dick says, the orientation and in certain situations we'll have operators or technicians go and clean the panels. But in most cases, the panels will actually melt the snow off fairly easily because they do increase in heat as they generate. With respect to solar windows, Ricky, sorry to be in front of you like that. I apologize.
It's okay. Go ahead.
I'm seeing them come right in front of my. There are some, I believe, maybe on the market technologies that do this kind of work, or that are, essentially solar windows. I don't know. I can't speak for their potential, or for their generating potential, or for their efficacy. We haven't implemented them yet in any of our projects. We are certainly investigating, solar cladding. So, actual cladding for buildings that has integrated solar PV, so generation from your wall space as well as your roof space potentially. And that's something that is probably a little more advanced than the solar windows. I think there's some solar blind companies out there as well. I don't know them offhand, and we've never worked with them, so don't take this as an endorsement. But there's lots of people doing creative things trying to implement solar generation into all different kinds of materials.
Yeah. So we're just so everybody is aware, we are not a research generator, so we only implement technology that's been proven in the market, and with an intention of earning an income that we can pay out to our investors. We do have members on our board who are researchers, so we're generally aware of what's happening in the market, but we're not implementing things until we're confident they'll work for us.
Yeah. Okay, the last question goes to Roy, and he asks, what should we be pressing for in forthcoming elections, both federal and provincial?
Yeah, I think you could go on.
I didn't hear the question. Sorry.
Just what should we be pressing for at the sort of political level in upcoming provincial, federal, even municipal elections? I would add my 2 cents, and I'll pass it to Dick because I'm sure he has more to say on this. I would say the like we've seen the federal government roll out are good, but I think there's areas for improvement certainly. Both in terms of who can access them, I think is a really critical piece of the puzzle, making sure they're accessible for all individuals, renters as well as homeowners, as well as folks living in different kinds of housing. I think is a critical one. On the renewable energy side, it certainly falls a lot to the provincial government. So I would definitely advocate for Things like the programs we've mentioned, virtual net metering, really just, I think, as Dick sort of alluded to, less rigidity in the renewable energy and sort of energy regulation space, broadly speaking, is fairly critical. We don't have to look far for examples of this, right? You've got every other state in the United States doing, really creative, but not exactly, groundbreaking work in renewable energy, and sort of finding ways to catalyze, finding ways for it to play a more important role in their energy mix. The Minnesota Solar Gardens is one that I just plant with folks to take a look at. It's among the leaders in the country, and something that I think Ontario and the Ontario government could learn a lot from. But Dick, I'll pass it over to you for the final word.
So when you say government, that's provincial, federal, and city. The most important one is the province, because electricity is a provincial issue, and the province needs to look at distributed energy, localized generation, and a true explanation of the cost of distribution, which they don't do. They talk about, Niagara Falls and 3 cents a watt. Well, that was 100 years ago that they built that. That's great, but we need to distribute the power across the province. At the federal level, they've got some programs for residential. They should be putting solar on every building that they own, and deep retrofits of their buildings, and cut out the oil subsidies that they're supporting. And at the city level, the same thing. They should be spending their money on this and keeping the money local as much as possible. That's obvious self-interest on my part there.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much, Aaron and Dick, for being with us for this hour. I think the discussion has been very interesting, both at the very applied individual level as well as at the larger policy framework and where the area is going. I'm sure that if people have questions afterwards, they can send them to us at Climate Legacy, to Group of 78, or to you directly.
Certainly. Yeah, I was just going to drop my email in the chat.
Yep.
Thanks, Rick.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'll give you time to do that. And thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.